The way it usually goes is Muhammad Ali is seen as the top heavyweight of all time, with Joe Louis just behind. On the strength of opposition, having run this real gauntlet of monsters and come out on top, that is seen as the decisive factor in having Ali above the Great Brown Bomber. But while most agree that there's kind of daylight between 2 and 3, very rarely will you see Joe Louis at the top of the heap, to the regularity where you start to think, well, is there even an argument for it? But that's when I've got to slow everything down here, just like Joe Louis used to do before lowering the boom, and say, actually, there is. Now, quality of opposition is my number one criteria when measuring greatness, but it's underpinned by 3 things, namely who you fought, when you fought them, and how you did against them. But it's that third and last point, how, that links to my second most important criteria, dominance. Probably the very first thing you think of when you say Joe Louis. 11 years and 8 months as champion, longer than anyone else in any other weight class in all of history, 25 heavyweight defences. The raw stats are startling. And there were statistics that Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali had to keep hearing about on the daily. This is the mountain you've got to climb if you say you're as good as you keep yapping about. But what I think aids with this comparison of resumes is that there's quite a lot of career symmetry. They were both young champions. They both had about between 3 and 4 years out for war-related issues, let's put it that way. And they both had ill-advised comebacks. If you look at their fight records, Joe Louis just had 8 more fights. And so with both all-time greats poised to see just who is going to claim historical dominion, allow me to explain with 3 points how Joe Louis might just find the gaps in the Ali resume and give it a few good dents that might just sway your opinion. Now, Sonny Liston, the man who Cassius Clay of course dethroned as heavyweight champion, he did most of his best work before he became heavyweight champion. Certain fighters of the past like Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, they did a lot of their best work before they picked up the title. And Joe Louis, despite of course being most known for having a tremendously long reign, he also did a lot of good work before he became champion. The record book showed Joe Louis to have fought 33 times before his first title fight, compared to Cassius Clay's 19 bouts. But while you may think, well, having more bouts, you probably fought more filler, actually, the opposite is true. Now, Bob Pastor and Al Ator, crafty contenders of the time, I think they're just as good of victories as whatever you want to say is the best Cassius Clay victory prior to Sonny Liston. There's not much to choose from. We got Doug Jones, Henry Cooper, and then you're really squinting at the record. Whereas for Joe Louis, what he did to former heavyweight champions really sets him apart here. Such as Carnera's reputation, ties with the mob. He used to be a circus strongman. Some of his fights may have been fixed. All these things are always so focused on that they've actually taken away from what was a pretty good fighter. And it was just a year after losing his title to Max Baer that Carnera bumped into Joe Louis. Or rather, Joe Louis buzzsawed his way through the giant Italian. Look how much bigger Carnera looks than Louis on the film, but Louis remains calm as always, with this very little movement as he conserves energy, and he just starts chopping the bigger man down. It's a beautiful performance. And then we come to Max Baer, a performance which is easily one of Louis's best. If you were to say you think it's the best Louis performance of his career, I couldn't argue. And funnily enough, a little footnote here, I believe Louis said something to the effect of, he just felt like he had boundless energy that night and could have fought until they decided to turn the lights off. Baer gets eviscerated here. He messed about in losing his title to Jimmy Braddock just the fight prior. He tries to go for Louis in this one, who eats a couple of good right hands and then just fires right back at him. Bear in mind, Max Baer had an iron jaw. Joe Louis chops him up in 4 rounds. And of course, how can we forget that triple left hook? So come 1936, Joe Louis's rise to the title looks absolutely inevitable, irresistible. And then he bumps into a certain German, another former champion, who claims to see something. And what of course Max Schmeling was referring to was the manner in which Joe Louis would drop his left hand after jabbing, and in their fight he proceeded to punish that mistake over and over again, timing the right hand over the jab, until Louis succumbed in the 12th, and he gave us one of the biggest upsets in heavyweight history. Well, Cassius Clay didn't lose before picking up the title, did he? I hear you say. No, he didn't, but Not forgetting all the great work Joe Louis has done up till this point. The Schmeling loss was the only one of the three that he'd suffered in his entire career that really meant anything. And what Joe Louis did to Max Schmeling in the rematch is my springboard to the next point. Prior to the 1946 rematch between Joe Louis and Billy Conn, the Brown Bomber famously uttered, "He can run, but he can't hide." I think that perfectly encapsulates just how efficient he was in rematches. It was like he made the ring smaller. He would adapt to your style, he would improve where he failed, he would zero in on your weaknesses, and there was pretty much no escape. Between Louis and the great Jack Blackburn, former fighter himself and his beloved trainer, there was always some potent antidote to whip up in the gym to defeat the opponent in the rematch. The only ones who were still on their feet at the end of the second fight were the very tough Emilio Agramonte and Cesar Brion. This can partly be attributed to the fact these were only 10-round fights, but more so to the fact this was a 37-year-old post-retirement Joe Louis who couldn't pull the trigger anymore. On the other 9 occasions, Louis was dominant/imperious. There were visible changes in his performance, and sometimes he really did hit perfection. While of course there was the dramatic political backstory to the rematch between Louis and Schmeling, just what Louis did, tactically, denying the German space, taking away the right hand and just taking it to him, destroying him in 124 seconds, might be the most potent revenge in all of Queensberry rules. The fleet-footed likes of Bob Pastor was tracked down, floored numerous times en route to being stopped. And the hulks of the age, the likes of Abe Simon, and particularly Buddy Bear, brother of Max, were chopped down in double quick time. But if I had to just go with one Joe Louis performance to really illustrate how he was able to adapt to an opponent in the rematch, vastly improve and get him by the scruff, it would be the Chilean brawler, Arturo Godoy. The first fight occurred in February of 1940, and Godoy did kind of what you're supposed to do against the counterpuncher, which is you rush them, and you stay on them, and you don't give them room to punch, and you've got to say he was pretty successful at doing that. Whether he deserved to win, no, most went towards Louis, but he felt pretty hard done by not at least getting a draw. He kept coming forward, he kept ducking very low, sometimes below the waistline. It made it difficult for Louis to land that classic cross, and he sure wasn't happy with himself when the final bell went. And so it put more emphasis on just ironing out those little problems in the gym with Chappie Blackburn. When Louis came back for the rematch just as early as June of the same year, this is how active he was. You see a Louis fighting a little bit more out of a crouch himself. He's just changed the level a little bit. He moves his hips away a bit, right? Because he's arcing, the body's harder to get to. He meets him a bit more shoulder to shoulder, and he just starts ripping in uppercuts. The real poison to a low bobbing fighter. Now, Godoy was pretty marked up after the first fight, but if you look at some of the pictures after the rematch, boy, the poor guy, it looked like he'd been attacked by a gang equipped with baseball bats. He was floored in the 7th, twice in the 8th, and the referee had no choice but to stop it in that very round. Now, Ali didn't do too shabby here in terms of immediate rematches, 9-0 with 4 knockouts. But this is kind of a case of fine margins, and if we try and draw a parallel to what we could come to agree are a similar level of opponent, it's Louis who you'll see who kind of one-ups himself, really turns the screw, finds the weaknesses. You look at the likes of the first round knockout of the Buddy Bear rematch, and it was like Louis was programmed to intercept whatever you brought to the ring that night. Now, if you're defending Ali here, you may want to interject and say, well look, the difference was Joe Louis was a big puncher. But no, it's not that simple. How many big punchers have there been in heavyweight history? How many great finishers have there been? There's a big difference there. There's been many of the former, there's been very few of the latter. And Joe Louis, for many people, still their pick as the greatest finisher in the history of the sport across all weight classes, had that unique ability to pick the right shots at the right time, to ration his gunpowder over 15 rounds, and to just disarm you so that he caught you sweet when you least expected it. And that ability of Louis's to keep you in the crosshairs at all times, eventually pull the trigger and leave no doubt, leads to my third and final point. I think most people would agree that after Joe Frazier, Ken Norton is the guy to give Ali the most trouble. For Joe Louis, it was probably Jersey Joe Walcott. Both Norton and Walcott real tactical pains in the butt. And just as a little preface for those who want to put up their hand and say, well, this is post-exile Ali, well, this is post-World War II Joe Louis, who isn't quite the same guy anymore. So, of course, Ali lost the first fight against Ken Norton in March of '73, getting his jaw broken and dropping a decision in what was a non-title fight. No, he wasn't in the best of shape, you can clearly see that on the footage, but part of being a champion is always showing up ready. Now, it was less than 6 months later that Ali and Norton had their rematch. Another non-title 12-rounder. This time, Ali just about edges things. Very close fight. Probably gets the last round, and that is what tips otherwise what would have been a draw, or you maybe give it to Norton. Super close fight. But the reason I'm putting more emphasis here on the rematch than the loss in the first fight is that the rematch may have seen Ali in the best shape he ever got into post-exile. The rematch against Joe Frazier and, of course, the Rumble in the Jungle would be the other two times which Ali was in great condition post-exile. But here we have a super svelte Ali, technically younger than those other two fights, dancing around for as long as he's able to, or is indeed allowed to. And if you listen to Ali in the post-fight interview, he's almost a little bit vulnerable. What he says is kind of revealing. He mentions his age, why he wasn't able to probably pull away in the manner in which he'd imagined as he was training and putting in that work. And then when we get to the last fight in '76, okay, now we are going to acknowledge this is post-Manila, and Ali is a different fighter again, degraded more so, but he is still champion. He is still racking up the defences. He would go on to defeat the likes of Ernie Shavers. He is still pretty good. And should Norton have got that decision in the third fight, that 15-rounder? A lot of people think so, and if you do give it him, if you do think he's honestly worth it, you do have to ask yourself how you'd feel about the overall tally being 2-1 to Norton. And if we continue down this hypothetical path, and we ask ourselves, well, what happens if Ali had fought Norton a fourth time, and lost, failed to get the title back again? Maybe he would have retired there and then. Well, if we play the same game with Joe Louis, and we acknowledge the fact he should have lost that first fight against Jersey Joe Walcott, who floored him in the first and fourth rounds, well, because Louis knocked him out in the rematch, all that would happen is you reduce 25 defences to 23, which is still the record, and Joe Louis would become the first ever man to regain the heavyweight title, preceding Floyd Patterson's milestone achievement by 12 years. So you see, going back to the dominance of Joe Louis, he really just squashed any doubts, any what-ifs, any shoulda, woulda, couldas. No, he didn't have a rival as potent as Joe Frazier, but looking back at Fight of the Century, acknowledging the fact they were both probably closest to their prime, and Ali lost clearly, there's another little grey area there. Now, unlike the 2-1 score against Norton, the one against Frazier isn't controversial. Ali rightfully wins those two other fights. But it was also dependent on Frazier degrading as a fighter, as opposed to just this absolute superiority. And so Ali is better described as really the best of the bunch, as opposed to this undisputed ruler, which is what Joe Louis was. Probably the main criticism you'll hear levelled at Louis is in reference to his famous Bum of the Month club. This phrase has kind of come back to haunt him, insinuating that his era was really weak, when often he just treated his better competition like they were hopeless as well. But as I've already alluded to, when you try and compare a similar level of opponent, similar styles, the difference seems to be that Louis was just more efficient. It allowed him to stamp out any controversies, it gave him the longest reign of any world champion, and it gave him the confidence to be able to inform a young Muhammad Ali that had you been around in my time, you would have been on the tour.